History, as we know it, has often been shaped by the stories we choose to tell, but some chapters have been hidden away, overlooked, or deliberately erased. One of these forgotten stories is the history of white slavery, a dark and complex part of the past that many never learned about.
When we think about slavery, most people automatically picture African slaves in the Americas. And while that history is undeniably important, there's another side of the story. A history that involves white Europeans who were enslaved, exploited, and forced into labor under brutal conditions.
Let's start with the Barbary Coast. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, pirates from North Africa, primarily from the Barbary states of Algeria, Tunisia, and Tripoli, captured over 1 million Europeans in a practice known as Barbary slavery. Ships were raided, villages were attacked, and entire populations were enslaved. These white European captives, many from Italy, Spain, and France, were sold in markets across North Africa.
Between 1500 and 1800, Barbary corsairs raided European coasts, kidnapping men, women, and children. Some were forced to row in slave galleys, while others worked in the harem of wealthy sultans or as domestic servants. For centuries, their stories were largely forgotten, overshadowed by the transatlantic slave trade.
But the story of white slavery doesn't stop there. The Irish too faced a form of enslavement. In the 17th century, the English forcibly removed thousands of Irish people from their homeland, often sending them to the American colonies as indentured servants. Unlike African slaves, indentured servants were not enslaved for life, but their conditions were often horrendous and many died from disease, malnutrition, or brutal treatment.
During the English conquest of Ireland, a system of transportation was established. Irish people, especially those from poor or rebellious backgrounds, were sold into servitude in the Americas, the Caribbean, and even as far as the West Indies. While they weren't chattel slaves in the traditional sense, their lives were hardly free, and their treatment was harsh. Many of them faced conditions similar to those experienced by African slaves.
Then there's the story of white slaves in the New World. Even before the large-scale importation of African slaves, Europeans were sold into bondage in the Americas. Spanish and Portuguese settlers initially relied on indigenous labor, but as populations dwindled from disease and war, they turned to European slaves, mostly from Portugal, Spain, and other parts of Europe.
Some of these white slaves were prisoners of war, while others were simply destitute or born into poverty. Once sold, they were forced to work on plantations, in mines, and in various labor-intensive industries across the Americas. It was a harsh life, but over time, the system shifted to focus more on African slavery, which eventually became the dominant form of forced labor.
Today, the history of white slavery is often overshadowed by the more extensive and brutal African slave trade, but it remains a crucial part of our understanding of forced labor in the past.
Modern-day museums and memorials serve as reminders of these dark chapters in history. They help us remember the suffering of all who were enslaved, regardless of their